I'd like to recognize the members at the speakers table. On my far right, Mr. Jim Smith, sports editor of the Indianapolis Times. Seated next to him, Dr. Richard Burkhart, Dean of Ball State College. Next, Margaret Earl McConnell, National Vice President of Alpha Phi Gamma. Seated on her left, Mr. John Schroet, Executive Secretary, Indiana High School Press Association. On my far left, Dr. Louis Englehart, Director of Journalism Instruction. And Larry Miller, Conference Director. And now I take pleasure in presenting Mr. Leon Parkinson, Managing Editor of the Monthly Press. Mr. Parkinson.
Thank you, sir. All young friends, before I turn to my assignment, which is that of introducing your speaker, may I, in behalf of the working newspaper men and women of Muncie, welcome you to our city. I am sure that your conference will prove very educational and informative, but I also want to suggest to you that one of the purposes of any conference is to have a good time. And I'm sure, looking over this group, I think you know what I mean. Now, in introducing your speaker, I find that I must be extremely accurate, for both the speaker and myself work for the same boss. And the boss sometimes is a little insistent that we be completely accurate. If I were to refer to the speaker's biography, it would cover but a part of his newspaper life. That since his graduation from DePaul University in 1935. But that wouldn't be quite complete, and I must be complete. His newspaper training has taken in his entire life, for I'm very sure that he cut some of his teeth on his dad's typewriter. I'm just as sure that he just as often got into the way of those who were trying to get out newspapers in Indiana, Kansas, and Oklahoma, where his father was an editor and publisher. And I'm sure that as the son of an editor, that he must have started a few columns on in his dad's newspapers, only to drop them in a day or two. Almost every son of a newspaper editor or publisher has done this very thing, and I'm sure your speaker is no exception. But now to get back to his biography. He worked for the United Press at Chicago, Detroit, and Buffalo. And then he came back to Indiana, where he served as news editor of radio station WIRE in Indianapolis. After a 4-year stint in the Navy, he came back to Indianapolis to become associated with the Indianapolis Star, where he served as assistant city editor and city editor. About 8 years ago, he was named managing editor of that grand old Hoosier newspaper, the Indianapolis News, the paper that has given us, among many others, such men as Bill Herschel, Ken Hubbard, Mark Thistlethwaite, and the almost legendary Billy Blodgett. As managing editor of the News, Your speaker is carrying on in the same traditional manner that has marked the news throughout its history. Your speaker is a board member of the Associated Press Managing Editors Association and is chairman of the Freedom of Information Committee of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. It is my pleasure to present Eugene S. Pulliam, managing editor of the Indianapolis News, speaking on the subject, the people's right to know. Mr. Pulliam.
Thank you, Parky. I wanted, as long as we're going to be accurate, in case the boss is getting this by long distance or something, I do want to correct one thing. I am not, have never been, and am not a candidate for the chairman of the Freedom of Information Committee of ASNE. I am a member of the committee, but the trouble those guys get into as chairman, I want no part of. I'm here to talk to you about the people's right to know, and I hope you'll pardon me if I read part of this speech. I don't like to read speeches, and I utterly dislike people who read them. But I had a very unfortunate experience a couple of years ago. I went up to Chicago to talk to the APME, that's the Associated Press Managing Editors. I was making a speech on sports writing and on cliches, with which Jim Smith down here is quite familiar. I had taken rather violent exception to what I considered very poor use of words in the AP sports report that year. So I was reasonably careful, I thought. I typed out some notes, and then I got so interested in my subject, I started to ad lib. I talked for about 10 minutes, complaining loudly about cliches. Some man in the audience, a very accurate newspaper man, stood up and said he thought the speech was very interesting, but he had kept count, and I had used exactly 15 cliches during my speech against cliches. Since that time, I've been more careful. I'm not going in this afternoon into a historical account of the people's right to know. It goes back a few centuries for one thing. And primarily, it's interesting, I believe, only to professional newspaper people. Someday you may get interested in it. I frankly doubt if you are now. I suspect that if you are interested in the subject at all, it's entirely possible that you're not now, but if you are, you're much more concerned with how it affects you today or might affect you in the future, rather than how it affected your ancestors in the past. Speaking of ancestors, after that long biography that Parky gave me, I'm looking at your bright young faces, I feel almost like an ancestor myself. One other thing I don't propose to do today is to harangue you about freedom of the press. I believe in it implicitly, part of my life. The Constitution of the United States says that we shall have freedom of the press. I don't think I can improve on that. Instead of going into any historical dissertation, I want to discuss several news stories with you, ones that have been in the news recently. I'd like to tell you how information about these stories has been either withheld or hidden, and then I want to convince you that such withholding of information defeats one of the basic assumptions of the American form of government. And even though you're only in high school or junior high school or college, it may seem to you a long time before you can vote. Perhaps you believe that you should be permitted to vote sooner, and certainly I do. It is of considerable concern, I think, to every American, and I think you'll discover as you get older that the things you remember are those you're studying now. I find the older I get, the less I learn. It's unfortunate, but it's a fact. Get back to the subject at hand. I want to read you an Associated Press dispatch that came out of Washington, D.C. It was dated February 22nd. It was George Washington's birthday, incidentally. It went like this. The House Ways and Means Committee went into a closed session to draw up a tax increase bill to finance a national highway building program. Representative Hale Boggs, author of a plan to impose millions of dollars in increased taxes on highway users, predicted his bill would emerge without substantial change. That's part of the story. I wonder if you caught one phrase in there, closed session. That phrase meant that only a few members of the House of Representatives, in their infinite wisdom, would meet privately to decide to extract from me indirectly from you, directly from your fathers and mothers, a few million other taxpayers, a few million or a few billion more dollars. Now, goodness knows we need more and better highways. I just came up here from Indianapolis, and we can certainly use a better road between here and Indianapolis, to mention only one of many in this state. And probably all of us are going to have to help pay for them. Someone's going to have to, and in this country the taxpayers do it. But when the decision is made as to how we're going to pay for those highways, what the money is going to be spent for, I think that decision ought to be made out in the open. The pros and cons ought to be discussed and debated openly and not behind locked doors. There's another story out of Washington. This came out last week also. Went like this. Joseph Wishart, chairman of the Nebraska Republican Finance Committee, told Senate investigators today how oil lobbyist John M. Neff contributed $2,500 to the committee's campaign fund last fall. Wishart gave his version of the contribution in a closed session with the staff of the Blue Ribbon Senate Committee, and so forth and so forth and so on. And then you come to the phrase, the special committee planned to question Wishart later in public. When that whole story finally got aired, as you may or may not recall, President Eisenhower decided to veto the gas bill. He said that if it hadn't been for this publicity and the story about this $2,500, he probably would have approved it. The point at hand, as far as I'm concerned, is why did they hold that session behind closed doors first and then have an open session later? What did they need to hide? Did this guy Wishart tell the same story in private that he told in public? Wasn't this the people's business? If someone tried to bribe an employee of yours, assuming you have one, wouldn't you want to know about it? Isn't a senator an employee of the people he represents? And aren't his constituents entitled to know about it? There's a question, of course, of whether I've just picked out a couple of unusual occurrences. Aren't most committee meetings open, and is it important, after all, that committee meetings be open to the public? Aren't all these things debated openly on the floor of Congress? Answering the second question first, as probably those of you who've had political science know better than I do, at least I trust you do, most legislation in our Congress is decided today in committee. There's a good reason for that, but it is a fact that it is decided in committee, most of the details. The debate on the floor of either the House or the Senate is more a matter of parliamentary maneuver than it is of debate about the details of a bill. Back to that first question, did I pick a couple of unusual cases? During 1953, congressional committees held a total of 3,105 meetings. That's a lot of meetings and a lot of hot air, incidentally, but nonetheless they held. 1,357 of them, that's 44% of them, were behind locked doors. In 54, they held 3,002 meetings, 1,231, 41% were behind locked doors. And nearly every one of the Appropriation Committee meetings in which our public servants decided to spend our money, nearly every one was held in secrecy. Those figures, incidentally, came from a Florida newspaper man who delights in pestering congressmen about their habit of holding closed meetings. I suppose he's written more letters to congressmen than certainly any person I know anything about. His name's Red Newton. He likes to tell the story of a school board down in South Georgia which closed its doors to both the press and the public. And in defending the action, the chairman announced loudly, "You're crazy if you think we're going to wash our dirty linen in public." Now, in this country of ours, it seems to me there's only one place to wash our government's dirty linen, in full view of the people whose government it is. If it isn't washed there, it's going to come out not clean, it's going to come out tattletale gray. So much for Congress. Not far from Capitol Hill in Washington is another outfit, the Defense Department of the United States. They have a tough job. I don't envy them that. But among other things, and I don't blame them for this, they do not want to reveal to Russia or to anyone else, enemy or otherwise, any military secrets. That's understandable, certainly. But using that reason and carrying it to an illogical conclusion, they have come up with some rulings that are keeping this country completely uninformed and, in some cases, completely misinformed. For example, late last March, Secretary of Defense Wilson issued a directive. I want you to listen to this mess of big words if I can get through it. This is a directive which limits the information function of the Department of Defense to that information which would constitute a constructive contribution to the primary mission of the department. Now, what that means is that to find out anything, you have to go to a public relations man in the Department of Defense. The trouble is, you can't get information from just anybody in the Defense Department. Who says so? Well, Brother Wilson, Secretary Wilson. By his orders, it comes only from the information boys, and they are the boys who decide whether a piece of information is constructive or not. Do you suppose, for example, that the news that a bunch of our fighter planes wouldn't fly was considered constructive? Apparently not. The Defense Department didn't say a word about it until a St. Louis newspaper man discovered the fact and wormed it out of them. Now, what I am concerned with is which is more important, in that case particularly. Is it important that we find out that someone goofed and make sure that he doesn't goof again, or that we keep it quiet and by doing so make a constructive contribution to the Defense Department? The people of this country, in my opinion, not some publicity man, should decide what is and what is not constructive about the defense of this country. Every arbitrary government in recent history has professed its belief and stated its belief in the release of information, but only that information that can serve the constructive purposes of that government. I'd like to tell you one more story. It's a little closer to home. It also involves the people's right to know about their government and how their money is being spent. This one concerns Veterans Administration hospitals. By law, any ex-GI is entitled to free hospital care for any ailment connected with his military service, which is certainly understandable. Furthermore, any veteran who is destitute is entitled to free hospital service for anything that's wrong with him. For example, in my case, I put in several years in the Navy. I'm not entitled to go to a VA hospital and have my appendix out if I had one, unless I would sign the equivalent of a pauper's oath and furnish a financial statement. Now that seems to make sense. Let me show you how it works out as a matter of secrecy and trying to find out how money is being spent. 2 years ago in Indianapolis, we learned that the following persons were or had been treated at the VA hospital there for ailments that definitely were not service-connected. A businessman worth more than $1 million, a successful and active practicing doctor, a small-town businessman who takes a yearly vacation in Florida, and the president of a successful undertaking business. We checked their credit ratings to verify those facts. They were excellent. The VA was doing nothing about it, and they wouldn't do anything about it. At about the same time, the American Legion, which has supported legislation concerning VA hospitals, had made a survey of chiseling in VA hospitals, and they said it was just, there was very little of it. They thought it was a dandy program. They did inadvertently admit, however, that they found about 2% of the patients weren't quite honest in their statements. Now, 2% isn't much as a percentage, but it cost the American taxpayer something like $10 million a year to care for that 2%. And I'm sure the Legion figures were quite conservative. Here's why. They checked only people who were willing to be checked and still found 2%. Personally, if I were cheating on somebody, I sure wouldn't let anybody check my record. We figured in that story that our readers, most if not all of whom paid taxes in one form or another, were entitled to know if they were being bilked. So we asked the VA to give us a list of non-service connected disability patients to see whether or not they were entitled to free care. We said we would not publicize their names. We would like to make a checkup. That request was referred to Washington. That's usually the way those things work. The administrator of the VA, a guy named H.V. Higley, quoting the law of the land, wrote this quote: "The administrator," that's Higley, "may release information when, in his judgment, such release would serve a useful purpose." Brother Higley informed us in the same letter that in his opinion a check of the hospital roster to determine if abuse took place would serve no useful purpose. The White House said its hands were tied, and that seemed to settle that. While this correspondence was wending its way slowly back and forth to Washington, the doctor who runs the Indianapolis hospital, who incidentally had been decent and understanding about it, and I think did as good a job as he could under the regulations under which he operated, he told us that he had 9 cases at the hospital over and above the ones we knew about, that he thought just might be a little irregular. He thought maybe they could afford to pay. Well, we wondered, was he doing anything about checking the cases? He said no, he didn't have any machinery, he had no staff, and he didn't have any procedure to check such cases. Well, he said, and we said, could we check them? Oh, no, they're confidential. However, he said he would forward them from Indianapolis to Washington and asked that a check be made there. So they were forwarded. So Louis Heiner, who's Washington correspondent for the News and for Sparky's Press here, called the Justice Department. Here's the way the conversation went. Says Lou, how about those Indianapolis cases the VA asked you to investigate? There's a voice on the other end of the phone. Well, what were the names involved? Says Louis, well, the VA says they're confidential and they won't tell us. Says the voice on the other end of the phone. Well, we'd have to have the names. We have hundreds of cases under investigation. I couldn't find out for you unless you can give me the names. As far as the American public knows, those cases still are just under investigation. And as far as the American taxpayer knows, those 9 people may still be undergoing free hospital care, and they may be doing it illegally. I have no way of knowing. As far as I can determine, there's no way in the world to find out. I am happy to report the latest chapter in this ongoing fracas we've had with the VA. A House subcommittee called the Moss Committee was empowered last year to look into governmental secrecy. Incidentally, it's an amusing note that Congress has gotten, suddenly, this one committee has got quite interested in secrecy in government, but they're interested only in secrecy in the executive branch, and they are not empowered to look into secrecy in the congressional branch. But at least they have gotten that far. Out of a clear sky, long after we had about given up as far as this VA thing was concerned, the subcommittee asked for our complete file on it. They're going to look into it. And I only hope that they're more successful, or at least more outspoken, than the Justice Department was in its investigation. Those are a few specific examples of news stories. In themselves, they are not of any great consequence. None of those individual cases, I certainly hope you don't believe that I'm saying, are going to wreck or ruin this government of ours. But if they indicate a state of mind in government, and I'm sure they do, and I think it's important, and I'd like to tell you why I think so. The American form of representative government, under which we live, is based on the assumption that elected officials are chosen by an informed voting public. And our system of elections and our checks and balances assumes that we continue an official or a party in power if he or they perform to the satisfaction of the voters. In other words, it's your government and it's my government. We elect people or hire them. The words are almost synonymous. We hire them to do the community jobs we want done. Now, that concept is reasonably easy to understand in a township or a county or even a state. But today our federal government has become the largest business in the world. In doing so, the people who should control it, you and I, and the people who administer it, they too are inclined to lose sight of the fundamentals involved. Because we've gotten to think of government, and I'm sure you do like I do, we don't think of it as a servant of the people anymore. We think of it as some mysterious thing that takes too much away from us in taxes, that something that pays old age pensions, or it passes unnecessary laws, or gives us subsidies for grain we don't raise, takes up too much space in the newspapers, or in the case of some of you here, calls you into military service just when you'd much prefer to get out and start making a living, probably on your own. We tend to forget that it is our government. We also tend to forget that if we are to manage our government through our interest in politics, which is what we should do, we must be informed about it. And we must know whether it does a good job, a fair one, or if it flunks on the job. We can't make those decisions if anyone in our government is withholding information just because it isn't constructive. There's a law in California which sums up very well, it seems to me, what I've been trying to say. It goes like this: the people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments they have created. So long as we remain informed in this country, we can retain control over our government. From then on, it is up to us, the people, and not up to the people we elect, to continue our government free and strong. Thank you very much.